recording from?
All right, good evening. Welcome back to Pump Up the Volume. My name is Luis Daniel Munoz. Again, if you're joining us for the first time in the show, I'm a medical doctor, previous gubernatorial candidate in the state of Rhode Island, also community advocate and organizer, currently serving on the Rhode Island Governor's Equity Council, and when possible, pushing hard just to make sure that communities that are often forgotten are being heard, and really, again, bringing community together to inform decisions that are made is something that I truly believe in, and I hope the administrations in Rhode Island start believing in. Joining me today, we have my fellow co-host, Mr. Scott Rotunda from WBOB 990, and also someone who is actively involved in terms of political environment and really has facilitated debates in the past and just been an active member of the discussion for a long time in Pawtucket and statewide. We also have Mr. Pat Ford, co-founder of the Libertarian Party in the state of Rhode Island and founder of the Coalition Radio Network, which we're actually streaming through. You may notice a different background today. I just want to lift up Pine Studios in Pawtucket. They do some amazing work, whether it's podcast, whether it's photography or videography. Definitely look them up. They've been helping me with a project, and it's been an amazing journey over the past few weeks, traveling around the state of Rhode Island, capturing a lot of beautiful scenery and a lot of important stories, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you all at some point in the near future. So starting with today, today's going to be a relatively short call compared to some of the calls we've had, which have gone on for up to an hour. But I think what we need to talk about today is pretty straightforward, right? And what we should and need to talk about is what is going on with vaccinations in the state of Rhode Island. But there's going to be some space for my fellow co-host to bring up other things. And so the rules of the game today are let's tackle one issue at a time. And if anything, let's stick to 2 to 3. And when we do address these issues, let's try to really inform our community members, people that are listening today, about why, what we're saying is important and how it affects their, daily lives. Because what I like for people to lead with is really with, enough knowledge to be able to understand what they can do to better the circumstances that we face here in the state of Rhode Island. So with that, we can talk about vaccinations, but I want to maybe push some things up to the forefront that my fellow co-host would like to discuss. So Scott, why don't we start with you?
Sure. As always, thanks for the time. Glad to be on here. Something I wanted to talk about, actually, it's something that's kind of concerning to me, is it seems like over the years, especially here in the Biggest Little, I've seen members of the media, and I'm not going to name names because I think that's pretty impolite. But anybody who's interested can go and kind of look at it and research it for themselves. Who, upon leaving their careers in media, go to work for the state government, usually the governor's office. And the reason I feel that's very chilling is this: the media is supposed to be the watchguard. They're supposed to be the vanguard of the people, if you will, always kind of having their eyes on those in power, right? And making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do and exposing them when they're not. But when there's one or two or more people of the media that then cross the line and evolve into paid members of the government, it makes me question how strong of I don't know if you want to call it the fourth estate or whatever, do we truly have? And are they really looking out for our best interests? Or is it, I think Pat Ford said it beautifully probably a couple of months ago, when you see the commercials and the reporters turn around and they look at the camera real serious, like, that's right, I might call you and ask a polite question about a press release that you gave. It's just something I've been thinking about a little bit, there really does need to be more than one degree of separation between media and those in power. And I feel really not only is there not even a degree of separation, there's almost a synergy, and it's kind of chilling.
My turn.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, Scott. I mean, yes, sorry, Pat, you can go.
Oh, yeah, no. I just going to say, first of all, I agree with Scott. There is the complete collapse of the media in this town has never been more apparent. The Providence Journal has essentially ceased to exist as a relevant journalistic source of, well, anything. You've got two folks there, Patrick Anderson, and then, of course, the famous Kathy Gregg. And other than that, what's the point? I mean, I can read 3-day-old AP reports live on my computer when AP actually prints them. So I see no source there. You've got the Beacon in more towards central Rhode Island. The Pawtucket and the Woonsocket papers have just, last person out, turn out the lights. I mean, most of these organizations don't even bother to show up at the governor's press conference every week, which shouldn't be a litmus test for anything per se, except for the fact that, you've got the possibility of at any week, not only a governor, but 3 senior cabinet officers standing there on a stage. And you can ask them just about anything as long as it's tangentially related to the pandemic. So the fact that so many of these folks are no-shows is telling and compelling. I'd actually like to talk about the vaccination process as well. So I am going to cede the floor to the good doctor and let him steer the ship.
Yeah, so I want to be clear, everyone, and I think it is important to, if one wants to be a leader, one has to have the courage to be vulnerable, especially if who we're defending, in our own minds at least, are the vulnerable. On Wednesday, as I was in Gillette Stadium helping, deploy a new technology system to help vaccinate thousands of people within a single day, I had 30 minutes, about 45 actually, of that day, listening in to the Equity Council call. And here I am seeing this massive operation at this beautiful place where only people with cars, could get to. And then I'm also hearing on the Equity Council call that an undocumented, high-risk woman is turned away from Esperanza Clinic because she could not present a utility bill or an ID.
Wow.
We are allowing an administration, the one that left and the one that's here, an administration that says that it wants everyone to vote and that they should be able to vote without IDs. That administration and that establishment is now forcing undocumented, high-risk Latinx community members to present ID or proof of utility bills in order to live. How immoral is that? Now, it may not be a big deal for people in mainstream politics. It may not be a big deal for people who, Facebook pride themselves on being epidemiologists by, some certificate program. But at the end of the day, every life matters in this state, and we are pushing people towards potential terrible ends by not allowing them to get vaccinated. And I just need to say that because at the end of the day, that is a pervasive problem. We are only giving hundreds of vaccines to high-risk community at a time. And yet this past week, we had thousands of vaccines allocated for a group that had a union defend them, a union present their risk, a union present, ultimately the value of protecting them versus protecting vulnerable communities. And no one is going to tell me that somehow the science dictates that we should give more vaccines in total number to people that are lower risk than people who already, the data shows, are dying in disproportionate numbers, are being hospitalized in disproportionate numbers. This is a really long way of getting to the point, Pat, but I just needed to really emphasize that I'm coming from a place of acknowledging the science, of understanding the science, and also understanding that we have an administration that does not care about equity, that is not taking steps to address the inequities in allocation of vaccines in the state of Rhode Island.
What was the response both by the Equity Council, by the organization itself? What was possibly the defense? And I guess, why haven't I read or heard about it?
Yeah, no, thank you. So a senator presented this concern. There was a representative not on the call that reached out to me, presented the concern. We have communicated with people. Some of those individuals are in what might be considered the mainstream media. The fact that this is not a story, I don't know. Maybe they're waiting for more data points to make it a story. But the key, back to your question, Pat, what was said? I took up a lot of space saying what we're going to do as a community if things don't change. But there were more crickets after that than there were words being said. I want to lift up, Reverend Jenkins for being one of the individuals on that call that had not only the courage and boldness, but really the substance and, lived experience to point out the fact that things don't change, that the misinformation continues, that our communities are used as plots in these beautifully narrated media stories. But when you look down and you dig deep, there is nothing happening. And when I say nothing happening, it is insignificant to provide 75 doses of a vaccine to a community center or religious institution when that institution serves hundreds of people. If we want to care for vulnerable communities, we need mass clinics set up with reserved spots to march these communities, high dense communities that have communities of color and white community members that are economically disadvantaged but still at high risk because they're in those dense communities, over to the mass clinic sites and get them a vaccine.
By the way, just as an anecdote, as someone who's been working his way through the vaccine system, it appears that the only mass vaccine center that's open on the state system is in Middletown. So take the problems in terms of logistics that folks in these communities and I don't know, square them, multiply them by pi in the spirit of the week, right? So, one could almost ask, what facilities of mass vaccination management exist? Folks are fleeing to their town sites. Listen, right now, from my perspective, and Dr. Munoz and Scott, you're the adults in the room here. From my perspective, this system is essentially melting down. I can't think of a more polite way to say it. In a situation where Connecticut got kudos from all places, the Wall Street Journal, for their "keep it simple, stupid." Literally, that's how the governor phrased it: "Keep it simple, stupid" method of just mass vaccination. Without this balkanization, without these categories, subcategories, there are more categories, if you will, of vaccination patients than there are, deputy chiefs of staff to Governor McKay. And that's saying something at this point, because there are a whole lot of deputy chiefs of staff, my friend, and they're making a whole lot of money. But that's another conversation. Doctor, you're firsthand, your boots on the ground in Massachusetts. What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? And again, as is always the case, how can we just learn from our neighbors?
Yeah, look, it's a massive operation. I can tell you pervasive, I can tell you the frequent problems that all states are facing. And then I can speak to how Mass is trying to address the major problem. Rhode Island uses an old software system. When I say old, I mean it's a template system that was provided by the government that is really not equipped to be easy for patients to use, or even, I would say, able to capture gaps in information. There's a disconnect between the first appointment and second appointment at times. And what that leads to is people are being lost in the system. A frequent issue is if someone gets a first shot and then they leave before scheduling a second, or their record for the first doesn't get submitted into the computer system. So what happens? What is the follow-up mechanism? When you are dosing, when you're giving vaccines to thousands of people, it is not scalable to have to call every single person. Now, I think the right thing to do is to call every single person. But what I can tell you now is across the board, including here in the state of Rhode Island, those phone calls aren't always being made. And so people are being lost that have the first vaccine. And the question is, are they getting their second? The second big problem, Pat, is, clinical ops, right? We have a state, Rhode Island, that loves giving millions of dollars to consultants. Now, the interesting part about consultants is they're not always operators. They come in, they give advice, and then we're left with having to execute on it, right? We're left with having to develop a quality system, a quality assurance system, to make sure that whatever is built, that whatever operation is designed is actually working. And Rhode Island has historically not done that well. We saw that fail with the contact tracing app. We then saw contact tracing not be able to scale when a lot of people started to get infected. We now saw with the vaccines the same thing. We saw that the mass vaccination clinics, as long as the National Guard was in control, is fine because they understand how to mobilize on the ground operations, right? Getting people through the door safely, organizing them, getting them the shot, getting them in the record, getting them out the door. But this municipal approach that McKee wants to take for someone who doesn't understand healthcare is really an irresponsible step for two reasons. One, you already have had challenges mobilizing enough individuals for operations to run completely smoothly and to have calls made to patients when something is not documented correctly. Now you're going to give it off to cities and towns that don't have as much experience as compared to what the state might be able to mobilize in terms of people resources. Second to this, now you're also creating weird scenarios, right? So if you give certain amount of doses of a vaccine to a religious institution, a community center, you now are forcing that community center to report out every hour about the temperature of the vaccine, the quality of it, right? So now the state creates a scenario where the standards required by the community centers to vaccinate may in fact be too high for the community centers to actually meet. Meaning this, Pat, if you cannot trust a community center in South Prov with 2,000 doses of a vaccine because they don't have the right refrigerators, because they don't have enough staff, then that is not the right plan to mass vaccinate vulnerable communities here in the state. And this is where it almost seems intentional that the Raimondo administration had started what the Raimondo administration started and what the McKee administration is perpetuating, which is a scenario where they are rationalizing and justifying the allocation of very small amounts of vaccine to communities of color within high density communities, whereas they're then allocating massive amounts, thousands of vaccine doses to groups that they expect to mobilize in these mass vax clinics. Groups that don't have as many transportation issues, groups that are not as reliant on public transportation, and groups that, for the most part, are privileged enough to likely not have navigation issues or challenges when dealing with a technology that's not that simple to use. So again, very long answer, Pat, but we need to acknowledge that there are layers to this, and at each layer, this administration is failing to have an equity approach.
Mm-hmm. Just go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
Jump in real quick. This kind of ties into my earlier point of why because I'll guarantee you many people are just hearing about this now on this broadcast from a medical doctor who can tell us about it. Why is our quote unquote independent media not reporting on this? Why are they not digging into this? I mean, are they woefully blind? God forbid. I hope I'm not right here, but are they actually complicit in this and sacrificing these communities on the altar of access to government?
Look, I can only, it's always interesting when you share data points, because without presenting the source of it, it's not as powerful. It's not, I would even put it into question. But what I want to just acknowledge on this call is there are people inside. There are people inside this administration, and they were inside the prior administration, that want things to change. They are seeking for us externally to put pressure, to force the hand towards progress, towards equity. And what I think is going on is that, your independent media, your mainstream media are looking for an administration to admit sets of data that would make them look bad. Why would this or any other administration that has a history of really not being transparent do that? Because if this administration in particular, the McKee administration, wanted to be transparent, they would acknowledge that they were told by consultants that there was a projection of 123 deaths by the end of this summer if the state were to reopen too quickly. And still the McKee administration is pushing to reopen quickly. Now, those deaths were not in South County. And I'm not saying that those deaths should be there. What I'm saying is that the lives that are at highest risk right now are in high density communities. And again, communities of color within those high density communities. And if we are not pursuing mass vaccination strategies to reduce the harm done, then that 123 lives that could be lost are going to come from those communities. And that's really the point, Scott, right? That you have to acknowledge that the data is real to act on it. And this administration does not want to present that to the media, to any media that might hold it accountable, less alone to a community that would suffer based on what its actions have been to date.
So I get that they wouldn't want to present that. That makes sense. But I would also think, there should be a lot more digging done on the part of the media. That's what media is supposed to do. Like, they're supposed to go and look for the story, not wait for the story to be served up to them.
Yeah, so I agree. You almost wonder, right? You almost wonder if they're just looking for the positivity rate to increase again, right? Like, what's the threshold? And that's the sad part, Scott. Like, do people have to get sick? Wasn't it enough that Central Falls had a 17.6% positivity rate? Wasn't it enough that we saw that Latinx community members and Black community members between the ages of 50 and 65 were being hospitalized at 3 times the rate compared to people that were 75 years and older and white? Wasn't that data enough? But it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like we need another surge before this becomes a story that's enticing enough to fight for historically disenfranchised communities to get a vaccine in this state.
It just strikes me, and this is not me trying to Monday morning quarterback, but just from a simple common sense, that in order to vaccinate Pawtucket and Central Falls, and I think we all agree at this point, the only answer is mass vaccination. Call me Mr. Obvious. By the way, simultaneously, Europe, particularly mainland Europe, if you will, is having its own nightmares. They're essentially falling into another massive shutdowns because of their inability to vaccinate at any level. But it just strikes me that there are a handful of buildings in Pawtucket and Providence and Central Falls where mass vaccination centers should have been set up right in the neighborhood with just, and if you have to do it by alphabetic order, that's fine. Whatever. Just keep it simple. We've got, to your point, we got communities operating at cross purposes with major mass vaccination centers who are, again, just like the tents and just like the testing was. I mean, didn't we learn anything from testing, Dr. Munoz?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, Pat. Clearly we haven't. Clearly, and I don't, I used to think that it was the Department of Health, but it really just seems like between the Department of Health and the administrations, plural, there seem to be these consultants that are hired really just to muffle us out, right? To somehow change the clear narrative that the science is showing, which is that people are not getting the resources they need. They didn't get it for testing. They're not getting it for vaccines. And gentlemen, while this call is going to be a little shorter today, I just want to point out that there's a solution here, and it is threefold. One is pre-registration. Get people appointments a month out, lock it in. Two, if you can reserve vaccine dosages for teachers, you can reserve vaccine dosages for communities of color. And three, we need protected days for high-risk communities. Mass vax days that are specifically reserved for communities to march their people, bus their people in, and get their people vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so with that said, gentlemen, I want to make sure you all give your thoughts on what you think the path forward is on this. And this is something that I have no doubt we will speak about next week. And by that time, given what myself and other community leaders have been talking about, it's likely that there will be a lot more happening in regards to it.
Scott, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. The path forward with this, and I'm going to keep with the theme that I've had all night, is, we need to keep the pressure on the powers that be to stop, frankly, throwing away the lives of these disadvantaged communities, as we've talked about on this show so far. And to do that, we need to also keep keep the media's feet to the fire too. And I mean, one thing that I would like is people that are watching this broadcast that maybe know people in the media. Hey, how come you guys aren't looking at this? But get them involved. Get the mainstream and the independent media looking at this. These should be statistics that we should be able to see every day. What gets measured gets achieved. And if we measure this, if we measure them on this metric, we'll be able to see the achievement.
I would just, this has been my theme all night. I would just like to come out with a grotesquely simplified manner of doing this. There are facilities literally in each city, armories, for example. In Pawtucket, I think of where the GAM used to be. In Central Falls, I think about that ice skating rink that's over there right on the Pawtucket Central Falls border. They should just be opened up, cleaned up, opened up, and had just whatever stocks of vaccine can be just located there. And, and just literally, if it has to be an around-the-clock effort at one solid location, and it be done alphabetically, literally, it strikes me that at this point in time, given the economic challenges, given the language challenges, given all the other challenges, every attempt, very professional, huh? Every attempt at automating these communities, every attempt at whatever, has just been an absolute failure. But I want to mix in also, I'm going to have a conversation with the AARP, and for a lot of reasons that are completely random or unrelated, a lot of the issues that face folks in the inner cities also face folks, as my friend used to call them, seasoned citizens, until he became a seasoned citizen. A lot of similar issues, not a lot of access to the internet, relying largely on church and family for communication, transportation issues, a lot of the same issues that mirror these folks. So why the state hasn't come out with a simplistic phone-based methodology is beyond me. We can't assume that the internet, the three people on this call are of different ages, All of us are highly conversant with technology. I love it when folks call me out because of my gray hair, that they point out that I'm obviously a technological troglodyte. Well, hello. I own a streaming television station. Sorry, we're not all like that. But why not identify those two groups? Because those two groups are the highest risk. And let's get the National Guard back involved at a half a dozen centers around the state, right in the heart of the poorest parts of the state, and just get it done. Keep it simple, alphabetic name, keep it open. If we have to keep it open 18, 20 hours a day, then let's just do it. There's a bleep load of federal money coming that hasn't bothered the state before to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a convention center that has barely held anybody, barely accomplished anything at any level.
All right, thanks.
I don't know. Keep it simple, stupid.
I hear you, Pat. So thanks so much. And look, today's call is brief, but it's a beginning, right, of next week's discussion. And I think what the key here is there has to be a will, even if there's money. State of Rhode Island has clearly shown historically it does not have the will, it does not have the lens of equity. And at this point, as community members, it falls upon us to advocate for the vulnerable in our community. So please remember, there are people being turned away because they don't have their ID, okay? And if we don't amplify that that's happening, then we're going to be passengers in this story that is ultimately evolving into something that seems more like a horror story, where people are being allowed, people that we should be taking care of are being allowed to go back home without a vaccine and run the risk, given their age and risk profile, of getting very sick. And they have families. So hopefully we can all fight for them. And between now and next week, look forward to seeing you all here on Pump Up the Volume.